thank you. Music's always great. I've said for a long time when the music's good, sermon can be average. So, yeah, clap for that. That's definitely something to clap for. So, yeah. Pastor Brian is not here today. He is, along with Tammy, over at the cabin in the Wallala Mountains where they're closing it up for the winter because if you know anything about there, it's going to get a lot of snow and it's going to freeze up. So they're trying to close that up. And so I'm here to stand in between those Sundays. He's finished up Matthew, or was finishing up part of Matthew's stories, you know. I'm going to use a Matthew text today. And then next week we start Advent. So, and you've already heard about the Night of 1,000 Candles as we start the celebration of the anticipation of coming of Christ. If Easter is about the atonement, the death of Christ, Christmas and Advent is about the incarnation, right? What did Christ live for? So anyway, today I want to talk about perspectives. But for those of you from the liturgical tradition, and if you don't know what that word is, you're not from it. Okay? So for those of you who know what I'm talking about, today is Christ the King Sunday. It's always the Sunday that precedes Advent. Now, the reason I bring that up is one, if you're ever on Jeopardy, okay, let me just say. In 1925, you can write this down, 1925, Pope Pius XI created something called Christ the King Sunday. And I say that because World War II or World War I had ended, but the world was in real division. There's a lot of polarity. The world was divided. There was a rise of nationalism in different nations. If you know anything about the history and world history at that point in time, after World War I, Africa and the Middle East were divided up by Europeans, and the countries that we now have on a map largely were determined back at about 1919, right? So lots of things were going on in the world. And so Pope Pius XI said, we need to refocus and understand that the center of our existence and faith is that Christ is the King. Christ's kingdom, what are we about? We are here to be focused on Christ. How do we see the world? We see the world through the eyes of Christ. So Christ the King Sunday was started out of a response to a global context that says, can we refocus on Jesus? So today, I want to refocus on Jesus by talking about perspectives. What is our perspective? How do we see Jesus? How does the world see Jesus? Now, perspective is simple definition. Perspective is a place where you stand and look. So I have a perspective because where I'm standing. You have a different perspective from where you're seated, right? So perspectives, there's multiple perspectives. And in fact, if you're an organization that's healthy, you want to make sure you have people who give you multiple perspectives. So a single perspective gets quite limiting, and you get myopic, and usually you struggle. So you want multiple perspectives. But perspectives leads to conflict. Now take a look at this. I've used this a lot. So take a look at this for a moment. You have two perspectives at play here. And you know what? The interesting thing about perspectives is you can both be right. So the problem with this is not that you have somebody who says it's a 6 and somebody says it's a 9, because from their perspective, they are correct. The problem is they can continue to argue and continue the conflict, or they can do something else. They can step back and get a different perspective, and all of a sudden they realize, well, now I see the problem. From where you're standing, it is a 6 or it is a 9. So both of you are right, but if you really want to know the bigger picture, you have to get a different perspective. Now, isn't this true of life? We often get in arguments like, by God, I'm right. And it's like, well, maybe you are, but maybe you're not seeing the complete picture. We'll come back to this. The Bible's full of perspectives. 4 Gospels, good example. We have 4 portraits of Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're all different. They're intended to be different. Their stories are actually structured different. We'll see that today in our text for Matthew, that Matthew has a whole other section to the story you won't find in Luke or in Mark, because they don't care about that part of the story, but Matthew did for his own reasons. So the 4 Gospels give us 4 different perspectives on Jesus, and that's the value. If we only had one, it would still be a blessing, but it would be kind of incomplete now that we've had 4. because all of them have their different ways of coming at Christ, right? And so I love all four of them for different reasons. Mark's short. I love because he keeps it short and to the point. John is the philosopher, and I love philosophy, so I love the Gospel of John. You know, Luke is just for the common person, and Matthew has this very church Old Testament-ish flavor that you've heard Pastor Brian talking about. So we have four different perspectives. The Old Testament's the same way. In the Old Testament, we have more than four perspectives, but in the Torah, we get these four perspectives. So you have the Yahwehist perspective. So if you read certain sections of the Old Testament, they're written from this perspective. There is the Elohim. That's another name for God. That's another perspective. If you want to see this at play, just pick up the Bible in Genesis, open to the first two chapters, and you'll see a Yahwehist and Elohim version of creation, right? You also have a priestly. Do you ever read Leviticus? Well, okay, whoever reads Leviticus. Okay. If you read Leviticus, that's the priestly stuff, right? Priests have a very specific perspective about how priests and clergy should function, right? So, and how they dress and all kinds of stuff. Then you heard of the book Deuteronomy, right? The Deuteronomist is another perspective. And so the Torah gives us, again, it's the multiple perspectives is the beauty of stuff. It gives us four ways of looking at something, right? So, but guess what? Jesus also had a perspective. So Jesus had a perspective, and you know you're getting a Jesus perspective when you hear something like this. You've heard it said, but I say to you. Right? Remember all the time in the Gospels when you hear that? Jesus is saying, now you've heard it this way, but let me tell you something. That's his perspective. Right? That's how he looks at something, and then he's going to tell you some really smart things you should listen to. So Jesus, he often comes out when he's talking to religious leaders. They're called Pharisees and Sadducees. Those are two political religious systems at the time of Jesus. I won't get into, you'll go back to your Sunday school lessons to remember who those guys are and what they believed in and stuff. But they are two political parties, if you will, within Judaism. They're religious parties, but they're very different from one another. They're always trying to test Jesus. And in fact, in Matthew 16, which is our text for today, they're always trying to challenge and test Jesus because they're trying to understand how he comes to the world, and they're trying to trick him and such. And so he gets to the part where Jesus says, this is the story you already heard before. Jesus turns to the disciples after he's had this thing with the Pharisees and Sadducees, and he even warns them. He says, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now, the disciples, they're not the sharpest pencil in the box. And so they often miss that part. And they're thinking, Lord, is it because we didn't bring bread? He's talking about yeast. And then Jesus think, you idiots, come on. Now, dude, all the stuff we've been through, and you still can't figure out metaphors, right? Like, he needed a lesson on metaphors for them. So they finally get the idea that, hey, the Pharisees and Sadducees, they have a yeast. They have this thing that can grow. It could be negative. So anyway, they finally get it. And then he turns to them with the following text. And he asks this wonderful question that you're all accustomed. You've heard this story before from Matthew. Now, Jesus came to his disciples, or came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, and he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? And they said, some say you're John the Baptist, others says you're Elijah, still others, Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. So what Jesus is trying to get at this is, how do people see me? What do people say about me? Okay, let me just say, Jesus, 21st century, how many likes does he have on Facebook, and what's his Instagram thing say? Okay, what's on X? What are people saying? So he just wants to see so again, perspective. What's people's perspective? How do people see in this? How do people understand me? And they have all these answers. We're not going to explore each of them. They all have some really good depth theologically to them. That you're John the Baptist, you're Elijah, you're one of the prophets, Jeremiah perhaps. Now again, understand that the Old Testament has informed those answers. So many of the people that are responding say, here's what I've heard. They have this idea of what's the Messiah going to look like. So they have a certain perspective based upon Old Testament, writings. And so these are the answers they come up with, right? Now, the thing is about the context here, that's all good. But then this is the best part of the text. Then he says, let me get it up. Then he says to them, but who do you say that I am? What do you think? What's your perspective? Tell me your thoughts. Now, Peter, who also is not known as the sharpest pencil in the box, blurts out, you're the Messiah, or the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered to him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father in heaven." That's a very nice way of saying, dude, you ain't that smart. Good answer, but dude, hey, come on, that's a Holy Spirit moment, man. You didn't figure this out on your own, right? So Peter just jumps out with this, like, dude, you're the Christ, you're the Messiah, you're the one, like you're the Son of the living God, and he gets an A. Okay, you will give him that, but Jesus is trying to say, man, this is deep. Yeah, I don't think you understand what you just said, right? This is from a deeper place to understand who I am. I'm not John the Baptist or one of the prophets. I am the Son of the living God, right? Finish up the text, and this is the part, when I said perspectives, this is the text you only see in Matthew. You won't find this in Luke or in Mark because they have a different agenda or perspective on how they're putting the gospel together. So he says this, "I tell you the truth, you're Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Footnote, that's the only time you'll find in the Gospels that word ever used. Church. It means assembly, gathering. "And the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." And then he sternly ordered the disciples, do not tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Now, there's a lot of things there we won't get into as well. As I said, it unpacks the idea of, for those of you who understand who I am, for those of us who understand who Jesus is, for those of us who understand that Jesus is the incarnation of God, on that foundation, I will build this movement that will continue on, and you're part of that today as we sit here. So I want to focus the rest of our time together, though, on this question, because this is the one that really matters this morning. How do you see Jesus? How do others see Jesus? Because I think how we see Jesus actually matters. Believe it or not, you probably already know this, that the church isn't the most popular thing in the country or the world anymore. Well, there's some real revival movements in Germany and different parts of Europe. The church on the whole has been declining. More in the southern hemisphere it's growing than in the northern hemisphere. If I started asking you to raise your hands, how many of your kids and grandkids go to church, you're going to see those hands continue to decline because younger generations don't come. Interestingly enough, though, they still like Jesus. Isn't that kind of fascinating? They still think Jesus is cool. But the church they don't necessarily have as much interest in. So I thought, I need to at least make some kind of gesture toward showing you some insights into an American Jesus. So how do people, say, how do we see Jesus? Well, what do? You Google it. Right? Jesus. Okay? So okay, there's all kinds of stuff I could do. I try to stay tasteful. And because there's a lot of weird stuff out there. But here's an American Jesus. Now, I want to go over this one for a moment. Okay, the hormonal stimulating Jesus on the right, your left. Okay, now, again, I call that the California Jesus. Now, we know that these pictures have nothing to do with the real Jesus because if Jesus' abs looked like that, nobody would have been healed and nothing would have happened. How many hours a day do you got to spend doing that to look like that? Like he didn't come, I come to save this, seek out the lost and stuff. It's like, dude, no, that's a poster for, Gold Gym or something. I don't know. The guy in the middle, there's a lot of gun pictures with Jesus, which I often find fascinating. Guns were not invented during the time of Jesus. Neither was the American continent. I mean, there's a continent, but the United States did not exist. But there's a real sense that the American Jesus, a flag, a gun, which I guess I figured would be more like a Chevy and an apple pie. But anyway, the fedora. I love the fedora. I like hats, but I don't get any halos on mine. So you got the halo Jesus there. I mean, nice beard, button-down shirt, though. Now, I really appreciate that. It's not even a polo. It's buttoned down. So my point then, you get this kind of what I would call familiar Jesus is the point of this, right? So what are you familiar with? All of them are generally white guys. You see that, all well-groomed and stuff. Nothing like a guy that never had the chance to take a bath much and camped out most of his adult life, wouldn't have looked like any of these. Now, just another one. I want to show you this. The Warner Jesus on the left, your left, is what we call the Warner Jesus. It's 1 billion copies of the Warner Jesus are around the world. I can't tell you, almost any place I've ever been in the world, I see a picture like this. It's called the Warner Jesus because Warner Press from Anderson, Indiana, the one who owns this, and so that's why it's called the Warner Jesus from there. The picture on the right is a Grunewald. It's a wonderful German artist from the 15th century because in the crucifixion, in his approach, everybody dies. So everybody at the crucifixion looks ghostly because in the crucifixion, it's like the death of the world, as much as the resurrection is the life of the world, right? Now, if you've ever been to my office, the Buddy Jesus, the one in the middle, I have actually, it's mounted because students gave it to me. In 1999, the greatest Gen X movie ever made about religion was produced called Dogma. Now, if you've not seen Dogma, I won't recommend it because the F word is an adjective for everything. So once you kind of get into the first 10 minutes or so, you realize, oh, that stands for everything, right? It's an irreverent approach to religiosity, but it holds all the orthodoxy in place, why it makes fun of it. That's a very Gen X thing to do. And so this was George Carlin's approach to say, this is the kindler, gentler Jesus. Not a crucified Jesus, but like the Buddy Jesus, And so I still value that. If you come to my office, you can see it. It's on the desk there. But let me just say, folks, how we see Jesus actually matters. This is fun, but the truth is how we see Jesus matters, right? Because it matters, because it gives us a perspective. As we see Jesus, that's how we will see the world. So if we have some interesting, maybe off-site or off-centered or incorrect views of who Jesus Christ is, then we'll see the world in ways that are going to put us in conflict. So how we see Jesus really, really matters. Now, I want to show you a couple other pictures. Not just, I'm a professor, I'm sorry. I want you to look at this. This is the oldest image of Jesus from the Benedictines. It goes back to the 5th century, 400s. From St. Catherine's Monastery. St. Catherine's Monastery is at the base of Mount Sinai where we think Moses did the 10 Commandments. There's a monastery there and still active. This is an icon that came from about that monastery and came out of, like I said, the 5th century. Now look at that image for a moment. I want to ask you what jumps out at you. What do you notice about the face of Jesus? As you see that, icons are meant to be looked through, incidentally, right? An icon means it's a window to heaven. You look through it. So that's why they're often really flat. Now, what's amazing about this picture is the perspectives that you have inside of it. So let me tell you what's going to happen in the next slide. If I put a mirror down the center of this face of that picture, this is what you're going to see. So think about it again. Picture down the center of the face, flip it one way or the other. In fact, I'll put it all back together. This is what you see. That's the same picture. Now, this artist, who had not modern technology, was trying to talk about the two natures of Jesus, the divine and human nature of Jesus when this was created. And it took a long time for modern folks to figure out what it was. And I think it was by accident that they discovered that there's two images in the one. Isn't that a beautiful perspective, again, on who Jesus is? Right? How do we understand Jesus? That's a wonderful way to see, like, Jesus is more than just on the surface. There's something deeper. That's the Gospel of John approach. So who is Jesus to you, folks? That's the question for the day. What's your perspective? How do you see Jesus? And how does that change the way you see the world? How you treat other people? How you understand what the future looks like? These are questions rooted not in our political narratives, but in our spiritual narratives, in our theological narratives. So let me throw something up. This is a modern version of something that came out of India, actually. This is an old Indian folktale. You know this thing? We have a book called The Blind Mice and the Elephant, but this comes out of India originally. And this is a corporate way of doing it. So you've seen this on perspectives. And I'm going to bring this back to Jesus here in a second. That if you're all blindfolded, you can't see, and you touch different parts of the elephant, you come to different conclusions. You probably used this in your corporate trainings before. Same thing I said at the beginning about the 6 and the 9. So we can argue and debate, and we often do in culture, and as human beings, we love to debate when we think we're right, especially when we believe we're right. and they will argue, but it takes maturity. It takes discipled Christians to step back far enough that says, if I think this is a rope because I'm holding on to something that feels like a rope, and you're saying that it feels like it's a wall, then if I can respect you enough, help me understand why you think it's the wall. Why do you think it's the spear? Why do you think, it's a snake? Can I respect you enough to step away from my own perspective, be it right or wrong, enough I can step back and say, help me see it from your perspective, so perhaps we can find a way that we can find either agreement or ways forward, but not get caught up in this constant bickering about who's right and who's wrong, and where hate starts to grow and love is pushed to the side, where Jesus is more of a t-shirt than actually a lived person in our lives. So we have to understand that it takes disciple Christians don't split churches. Shallow Christians do. Now, folks, there's a gospel perspective. But let me say before I get to the gospel perspective, let me just say this, because I'm blunt. If you let your politics, whatever they are, if that's the filter through which you see your faith in the world, you will always stand in conflict with both. If you let your faith be the way you see your politics in the world, you will struggle because your faith will demand of you things that the politics will not. But if you let your faith be the glasses, if you see the world through the eyes of Christ, it will demand of you things that you won't want. That's why it's easier to see your faith through some other agenda, corporate stuff, social things, politics, leaders, because it's easier to do that. It's harder to do it from the eyes of Christ because it demands of us some integrity and the idea you can't hate people and be Christian. What does the gospel tell us over and over? Love your neighbor as you love yourself. It doesn't say hate your neighbor. It says love your enemies. Oh my God, where did that come from? No, not devastate your enemies, love them. Right? We can't be people of hate. Treat others the way you want to be treated yourself. That alone should change the world. You help the needy. You care for widows, orphans, and by God, you help strangers in the land. That's Old and New Testament. You don't judge others unless you want to be judged yourself. All the fun stuff is taken away. You can't talk about people. You can't hate people, right? How did we get to the place where we can't see the world through the eyes of Christ? You be whatever you want. I'm a political independent, so I make fun of all of you. But I don't care if you're Democrat, Republican. I don't care if you like the election or hate the election. What I'm trying to say is, can we please, for God's sake, see the world through the lens of Jesus Christ? It's a choice, and it matters. It matters. I have too many people who have families that split over politics, who won't talk to each other because they come from different. Who cares? At the end of the day, man, people are president for a short period of time, and then they're forgotten. They build libraries so people remember them, and then when's the last time you've been to Andrew Jackson's Heritage? I mean, my Lord, come on. It's like, oh yeah, he was president once upon a time. People come and go, but family, right? It matters. If we see the world through the eyes of Christ, if we see our families through the eyes of Christ, if we see conflict through the eyes of Christ, if we have a perspective through the eyes of Christ, if we can choose to see that, the world will be better. Even if we don't agree with everything that happens and policies are in place, it will be better because we can, part of our values is to what? Change the world. You can't change the world if you can't see the world through the eyes of love and compassion and mercy and empathy and giving a damn about other people. You've got to see the world through the eyes of Christ if we have any hope of being a witness to a world where Christianity still has value and not become manipulated with some kind of social political narrative about what the Christians want the world to look like. Christianity can and will become an oppressive agency if we are not careful. It will not attract people, it will repel people. Because of the perspective we pray, can we see the world through the eyes of Jesus Christ? Amen. Lord, thank you for your words in the gospel. They challenge us. There's lots of things in the Bible we really wish there weren't. It'd be easier for us it's much harder to live the world through your eyes, to love our enemies, to be hit on one cheek and turn the other, to ask someone for my coat and you give them your shirt. It's harder to live out the gospel you've called us to. But the only way to see a world going forward in productive ways in which we transform it is to see it through your eyes. So help us. Give us the grace and the wisdom. Give us, oh Lord, your Holy Spirit to inspire our imaginations, to touch our hearts, so we can help transform this world with the love of Jesus the Christ. Amen.